Some scenes are easy to write and they flow very naturally. They flow very naturally both from the scene before them and they flow just within the context of writing the scene. They could just seem to pour out of your fingers, and it's really easy to go from the beginning to the end, and it has a natural arc and it has a natural conflict, and it's great and it's easy and it's fantastic. And I love writing scenes like that. I'm sure everybody loves writing scenes like that. There are other scenes that are much more difficult to do. That's a leaf blower in the background. I'm sorry, I'll hold on until that's gone. I think he's following me. No, I'm kidding. He's not following me. It just feels like he's following me. Everywhere I go, there's a leaf blower. I actually find it very helpful to imagine that I am setting a stage production when I'm doing my scenes, because it helps me remember the important elements. What are the elements of a scene? Well, first of all, you can divide them into two categories. You have the physical or outward elements of the scene, and you have the motivational or internal elements of the scene. They're equally important to create a dynamic scene. I usually try to remember to fill in 4 physical elements and the 4 motivational elements. So the 4 physical elements that you always need to consider are 1, setting, 2, characters, 3, blocking, that's also the action of the scene, and 4, it's good to jot down some notes about the busy work, and I'll explain what I mean by these terms. The 4 motivational settings are goal, motive, conflict, and change. So let's go back to the physical and dig deeper into that for a little bit. The setting is obvious. Early on in a book, you have a lot of scenes that are setting rich, because early on in the book is where a lot of the description for new scenes will come. Although if you also have a travel book where people are moving from one place to another, so there's also scenes near the end of the book where they're traveling. Anytime basically you have a scene where people are entering into a new environment, that's when you have to richly populate that with the majority of your description. And you want to get the description out of the way, so to speak, so that when you have the faster paced action near the climax of the scene, and especially near the climax of the book, you don't want to be slowing down your action with description. So there's some scenes that are just by their nature and by their position in the story and their position in the novel, they're going to need more description. So description is one factor or one kind of writing that can slow down a scene for me, because that's something I have to sit there and think about. This place, where are they? I'm not just thinking about the characters in conflict with each other, which, by the way, should be driving the scene, is there should always be a conflict at the heart of a scene. Even a fairly slow scene, there should be some implicit conflict in the background. But you don't want white room syndrome. That's where you can't visualize where the place is, and so it just seems like the characters are standing around in a white room or an empty set having a discussion floating in space. Usually the reader will just sort of fill in some kind of bland background, but it won't feel alive. And if you've ever read, I read a lot of indie books especially that, let's be honest, are published before they're quite ready to be published. And one of the biggest flaws I find is this lack of description. And so I don't feel rooted in the story. Even if it's supposed to be a fantasy story, there's just a few very vague general references to cliche fantasy things. They're in a castle, or they're in a throne room, or they're in a field, or they're in a forest or a tavern. And that's all that we get. And sometimes we don't even get that. I remember reading one fantasy book where I honestly had no idea where all of the action was supposed to be taking place. The people were traveling around, and yet I didn't know where they were going to or where they were coming from. I had no picture in my mind whatsoever where these people were or what it looked like. It took me a long time to realize that it actually was supposed to be taking place in England. It was a British author, and she apparently just assumed that everybody knew she was writing about England. Well, she never said that, and her characters were elves, so how was I supposed to know it was supposed to be modern England? There was just, oh my gosh, there was nothing, there was no description. You can't have scenes like that. That doesn't work, please. So you want to have the description, but you don't always want to be writing that at the time that you're writing the scene. And so this is one of the techniques that you can use to do a more difficult scene, is to put it on in layers and to block out your outline in layers, so that when you do sit down to do the actual writing, the tying it all together, you either do that in layers as well, or you've already layered on your outline. And so you have all those pieces coming together. So different layers that you might want to create to prepare your scene. A great way to prepare for writing description is to actually go through pictures that remind you of your scene. If you're using fantasy, you might have to go a little more exotic. But you can also make your own collages. Remember, nobody's going to be seeing them. I mean, unless you are doing video. If you're writing a novel, you're not doing video. So you can cut out a castle, you can put it in a park, you can cut out a dragon, you can put it in front of the castle, you can cut out a beautiful elf maiden, put her riding the dragon. You can also combine different things. You just have to be careful that it's not something so recognizable that it's either cliched or copyright. Generally, you writing about a place, I don't think that you could even copyright that. Next, you need to know who's going to be in the scene. Again, it's something that seems obvious, but you really need to set it up. And you also need to do yourself a favor and make certain that you don't have too many characters in every scene. Let's say that you have a large party traveling together. It's got 7 or 8 characters. What you want to do is pare that down so that in each scene, you're really focusing at most on 2 or 3. There are a few big scenes where you're really going to have 7 or 8 characters interacting at a time. And I don't mean battle scenes, but where there actually going to be dialogue between all of these characters at the same time, where they can all hear everybody else. Maybe a council scene or a banquet scene, or it could be a battle scene where people are actually, throwing witty comments at each other, or revelations are happening on the field of battle. Those are very rare, and they're also very difficult, and they need to be handled in a special way. Normally, try to make your scene so that the focus is going to be, imagine the camera angle, zooming in just on this one or a pair, or at most 3 or 4 people at a time, so that you know who your characters are and you know who's going to be the focus point of the scene. And if there are other characters in the room or in the vicinity, you need to establish what they're doing and also establish subtly that they're in the background and they're not the focus of this scene. So, for instance, you could say, while Matilda and Claude fussed with the weaving, Amy sat down and asked Guinevere what she thought of Lancelot. All right, there you go. You focus down your scene. Next, you need to know the blocking. This is obviously super important. So many scenes, and I'm totally guilty of this. I do this all the time, and I really need to think about it. Putting good action into my scenes. And if I don't think about putting good action into my scenes, then my characters just turn into talking heads. And they're just boring. They're just boring characters if they're just standing there talking to each other like they're in a freaking news. So I need to decide what the action is for each scene. Now, some scenes simply will just be a conversation, or in mine, because it's fantasy and people have to travel by foot a lot of times, I will often have scenes where people are simply on a trail, a dirt trail, in a forest or a meadow, simply walking together and having a conversation. It's not super interesting, but I do have scenes like that, and I need to know what's going on. And if I can add a little more action to it, then I do. And then that brings us to something that's not action, but is related to it and is really helpful to decide in advance or to give your characters busy work. Now, in a stage, what you have is when characters are delivering their lines, they often have something to do on the stage also, so they're not just standing there delivering their lines with their arms up in the air in a dramatic way, looking somewhat silly. So they'll give them some busy work or something to do. And I can't remember if they use that exact term or a different term, but it means the same thing. It's action that they have to do that keeps their hands busy or gives them some reason to be on the stage, or something that they're doing while they're having this conversation. Because very rarely will people sit down, face each other, hands on their knees, and simply look into each other's eyes and have a deep conversation. Usually they're doing something. And if they are sitting in that position and doing that, that in itself is very significant and is something that you need to describe when you're writing about it. Why they're doing that, and although that'll get into the internal motivation a little bit, but you're going to have to explain what position they're sitting or standing in, or what movement they're making, and what they're doing with their hands. And the other real advantage of busy work, and this also is helpful for description, is when you have a long dialogue between 2 characters, one, you want to make sure you don't have dialogue longer than it needs to drag on. In real life, people have very long, boring conversations all the time, but you want to try to skip those in your book. Even if you want to indicate, well, it was a long, boring conversation, you can give the first 2 couple of arguments. For instance, if you're reporting on a conversation between 2 8-year-olds, no, you aren't, yes, you are, no, you aren't, yes, you are. That's enough. We know that 8-year-olds can go on for another hour and a half half just repeating those two statements, but nobody wants to read about it. Nobody, especially parents. We don't want to read about it. We already hear about it in real life. So you can simply give a sense of the tedium that is to come and then summarize the rest. Those two statements were repeated ad nauseum for the next hour and a half over the car ride that felt like the longest car ride in her life. You don't need to have a long dialogue, but often you do have very important or emotional or whatever dialogue, and you want to have some busy work in between so that you don't have to simply say, "I hate you," Kelly said. "Well, you betrayed me first," Anthony replied. "No, you betrayed me," Kelly said. Okay, I'm going back to the conversation between 8-year-olds, but you know what I mean. Let's say that the conversation is interesting, the dialogue is great, but you need to have these characters have something to do while they're talking to each other, and that is, she lifted the trophy and threw it at his head. "I never want to see you or your trophies again. I hate you and everything about you." She lifted his golf club and swung it at him. All right, it won't always be that dramatic, but you know what I mean. You have to have them doing something. Again, if you don't have them doing something, you'll just fall back on a couple of stock phrases that you tend to use over and over. I always have people looking at each other or looking away from each other, so my conversations get very boring very quickly. She looked at him. "Is that true?" she asked. He looked away. "I can't answer that." Then he looked at her. "But I can tell you this." She looked away. "Don't talk to me." You know, oh my God, it goes on. And I just tend to have always people looking at each other and the eyes and whatnot. And I am thinking cinemagraphically in my head. I'm thinking of very charismatic actors and actresses, the way they can convey so much in a single look. But it just doesn't work in a book the same way. Saying he looked at her just doesn't convey the same charm and charisma as having Jon Snow staring at Daenerys Targaryen, right? It's just something is missing in the description. So you have to take advantage of the written form and put in some of that emotion. So that's where we get to the motivational parts of the scene as well. The goal, first of all, always have every character in the scene needs to have a goal. And you need to figure out, basically the motivational thing is going to be an emotional arc. From the beginning to the end. Every scene should be a miniature story. It starts one place and it ends another. So in order to do that, for every single scene you have to remember goal, motive, conflict, and change. So every character has a goal. They have a reason for having that goal, the stakes of that goal, the motive and stakes. I've kind of rolled that up into one. You could think of it as two separate things, or you can think of it as one. And their emotional investment. You could think of that as separate also, but for me, this is all just rolled up into motive. The goal, and it's the immediate goal. They have the overarching goal of the story, but in every single scene they have an immediate goal. Could just be to cross through this room, and then you have to get to the conflict. They need to cross through this room, and there's a crocodile in the way. Every character should have their own goal, and if you make those goals at cross purposes, then your conflict will simply pop out at you, and it's obvious what the conflict is. Character A wants X, character B wants not X. They're gonna have a conflict. It doesn't mean that they're gonna start punching each other, but it means that they're going to be working at cross purposes, and that's gonna cause conflict, and that's going to make a good scene. It can be as subtle as you want, or it can be as overt as you want, but there needs to be conflict. They don't necessarily have to know they're in conflict either. They could be cooperating on a certain goal. They both want to reach the same goal, but they have different motives for reaching it, and their motives are conflicting, or their motives could be the same. They both are good people, want to save, the planet or whatever, but their goals for achieving that are different. Somewhere there has to be the conflict between them, because that's the third most important part of every scene, is that you have to have a conflict. Now, what if you have simply a character sitting by themselves, contemplating what happened in the previous scene? Where does this conflict come from? Well, this is when you make the character at conflict with themselves. The character has more than one goal or more than one motive, and those are the things that are those are conflicting inside the character, almost like persons, almost like living personalities. So they're animated almost like two voices talking to each other. Now, you don't have to have the person actually talking to himself or arguing with himself, but that is the essential element that's going on here. In Lord of the Rings, in the movie, they show this really strongly, where they actually have the two Schmeagol's Schmeagol talking to Gollum, the possessed part of himself arguing against the interests of the core of himself, which becomes weaker and weaker and finally loses. It's a very dramatic way of showing it. But anytime you have a person alone in a scene, that's the kind of conflict you're going to need, the person against themselves. Or it could be also the person against the environment. You can also have the person against, if there's the goal of the person is to cross the room, their motive is they have to get to the other side to save somebody, and there's an alligator in the way. You're going to have, obviously, the man versus environment kind of conflict, where this person has to figure out how to either fight or not wake up the alligator. But you also want to have some internal conflict. The person could also be battling their own fear about crossing a room with an alligator. Or maybe they're battling their own rage issues and their first instinct is simply to beat the alligator to death and spend all their time in the room beating the alligator. They enjoy it so much they never get to the other side of the room. It depends on the personality of your character, obviously. The final thing that you need to remember in the motivational elements of a scene: change. There has to be a change in something. The hero is either closer or farther away from the goal, or it could be a villain scene. The villain is either closer or farther away from the goal. The emotional state has changed. The hero started the scene happy, ends it sad, started the scene sad, ends it hopeful, etc. You need some change. That's what gives your story the arc. Start in one place, end in another. The arc is how you get there. Every single scene needs to have an element of conflict and have change. Finally, in addition to the 4 physical elements and the 4 motivational elements, you have what a lot of people think of when they think of a scene, which is the dialogue. Sometimes it helps to write the dialogue completely separately. But a lot of times I will start with the dialogue, because you're starting with, it's a simple way to start a conflict between 2 people is they're having an argument or they're having a discussion and it reveals a conflict. Sometimes I like to start with the setting and then the dialogue will grow out of the setting, because it gives the characters, especially if you want to have a conflict but you don't want it to be open. The one character wants to go, the other character wants to stay, but they're not going to openly argue for their own position. This is if you want to have a more subtle scene. So instead, figure out what they're doing in this room besides arguing about what they're going to do next. They're actually arguing about what they're going to do next, but you give them some busy work, you give them another immediate task, and then you sublimate the conversation into the dialogue. So instead of talking about themselves, they're talking about this loom. I have a lot of looms because I use looms in my story, so sorry for the looms. The shuttle needs to go forward. It keeps getting stuck in one place. If we can make it go forward, we can fix the loom. And he says, maybe you should just leave it alone for now, let it rest. Maybe it's become worn out from too much back and forth motion. It's tired out. It's a loom, it doesn't get tired out, she said, wiggling the loom piece, etc. So they're having a conversation that is not really about the loom, but is in the immediate storyline about the loom. So that's the elements of the scene, and I guess I started with 8, and then I realized I had forgotten dialogue, which is usually the first thing I write. So 9 elements of a scene. All right, Tara out.